Some brides receive flowers on their wedding night. Others receive proof that their entire life has been a lie. The wedding guests had already gone home when Evelina Whitcomb first began to understand that something inside Blackthorn Hall was watching her. The great house stood against the November rain like a monument built for secrets rather than people. Its towering gray stone walls disappeared into the dark mist rolling over the hills beyond the estate. Water slid slowly down the enormous windows. Candlelight flickered behind the glass in long trembling lines. Somewhere above the eastern wing, thunder moved across the sky with a low distant growl. Evelina stood alone at the center of the bridal chamber, still wearing her ivory silk gown. The fabric felt heavier now than it had in the chapel 3 hours earlier. The corset pressed tightly against her ribs. Her veil had already been removed by the servants, though the pins still tugged painfully at her scalp. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and rain. She had not moved for several minutes. Neither had the Duke. Lucien Ravenshade stood near the fireplace with one hand resting behind his back. Tall. Severe. Entirely composed. Firelight moved across the sharp lines of his face without softening any part of him. At 42, he carried the stillness of a man who had spent too many years being obeyed. His black coat remained perfectly fastened despite the late hour. Even now, after the ceremony, after the guests, after the endless whispers that had followed her through the chapel like smoke, he looked less like a husband than a judge preparing to announce a sentence. Evelina kept her eyes lowered. She had learned years ago that silence was safer than curiosity, especially around powerful men. Especially around men who paid enormous sums of money for frightened daughters. Outside the chamber doors, the last footsteps faded down the corridor. Then the house became quiet again. Not peaceful quiet. Watching quiet. Lucien finally crossed the room. His polished shoes made almost no sound against the dark wooden floor. Evelina noticed his shadow before she allowed herself to look directly at him. He stopped beside the small table near the fireplace. Upon it rested a black velvet box, small enough to fit in one hand, old enough that the silver corners had faded nearly white with age. Her breath slowed slightly. Every woman in England knew stories about wedding gifts from wealthy dukes. Diamonds, estates, pearls older than kingdoms. But nothing about the object before her felt celebratory. It looked preserved, like something buried for years beneath dust and silence. Lucien touched the box once with his fingertips. Open it. His voice was deep and calm, the kind of voice that never needed to rise. Evelina hesitated only briefly before stepping closer. Her slippers brushed softly against the carpet. The fire crackled behind her. Rain tapped against the windows in slow, uneven patterns. She became aware of her own heartbeat. Not fast, not dramatic, just painfully present beneath the silence. The box felt colder than it should have. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edges as she lifted the lid. Then she stopped breathing. Inside rested a small silver necklace. Delicate, tarnished with age. A tiny oval pendant hung from the chain, no larger than a $quarter coin. One side bore the engraving of a crescent moon. The other carried a single tiny crack running through the metal. Evelina stared without moving. The room around her seemed to recede slowly into shadow. Her fingers trembled once, very slightly, then became still again. She knew the necklace. She knew the crack. She knew the tiny uneven shape of the moon where one edge had been scratched years ago against stone. Impossible. Her throat tightened. Not from fear. From recognition. Lucien watched her carefully. Do you remember where you lost it? Evelina lifted her eyes toward him for the first time that evening. The Duke's face revealed almost nothing, but his gray eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made the candlelight feel colder. I never showed this necklace to anyone, she whispered. Her own voice sounded unfamiliar inside the enormous room. Lucien said nothing. The silence stretched between them. Heavy. Intentional. Evelina looked back at the pendant. Memory moved suddenly through her mind like lightning beneath dark water. A forest path. Rain. Cold mud against small shoes. The sound of horses somewhere far away. Then nothing. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared. She pressed her fingertips harder against the velvet lining. I lost this when I was 6 years old. Lucien's expression did not change. Yes. The answer settled into the room quietly. More frightening than surprise would have been. Evelina felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her balance. At the wedding earlier that afternoon, she had believed she understood the shape of her misery. Her bankrupt father had sold her marriage contract to one of the wealthiest men in northern England. Society whispered that the Duke of Blackthorn was cold, aging, and impossible to love. Women lowered their voices when speaking his name. Servants avoided the east wing of the estate after dark. 3 housekeepers had resigned within 1 year. No one explained why. Evelina had entered the marriage expecting distance. Perhaps humiliation. Perhaps loneliness. Those things belonged to ordinary suffering. But this was something else entirely. This felt older. Planned. Lucien reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He removed a folded piece of paper yellowed with time and placed it gently beside the velvet box. Evelina stared at the handwriting before unfolding it carefully. The paper shook once between her fingers, then became still. Written across the center in faded black ink were 5 words. For Evelina. When she returns home. The fire snapped sharply behind her. Evelina looked up slowly. What is this? Lucien studied her for several seconds before answering. A message left 18 years ago. Her pulse began to pound harder now. By who? Another brief silence. Then the Duke spoke quietly. By your mother. The room seemed to contract around her. Evelina took one small step backward. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. Dead women did not leave messages inside locked velvet boxes. Dead women did not speak through strangers. Yet the necklace remained cold and real in her hands. Lucien moved toward the windows. Rainwater slid behind him in silver lines across the dark glass. Your father told you she died from fever, he said. Evelina nodded once automatically. He lied. The words landed softly, almost gently. Somehow that made them worse. Evelina stared at the paper again. The handwriting was elegant, precise, unfamiliar and strangely familiar at once. Her chest tightened. Why do you have this? Lucien looked toward her over his shoulder. Firelight caught briefly along the silver at his temples. Because I have been searching for you since the winter you disappeared. The silence afterward seemed endless. Somewhere deep inside the enormous house, a clock began striking midnight. One slow chime at a time. Evelina stood frozen beside the fire with the silver necklace trembling faintly in her hand, while the Duke of Blackthorn watched her as though he had already known this moment would come long before she ever stepped inside his house. Evelina did not sleep that night. The bridal chamber remained dark except for the weak orange glow of dying firelight beneath the marble hearth. Rain continued against the windows until nearly dawn, sometimes softly, sometimes with sudden force that rattled the old glass inside its frames. She sat near the edge of the enormous bed without removing her gown, the silver necklace still resting cold against her palm. Across the room, the black velvet box remained open beside the folded note written in her mother's hand. Or what she believed was her mother's hand. She no longer trusted the shape of certainty. Every few minutes her eyes returned to the words again. For Evelina. When she returns home. Home. The word disturbed her more than the necklace itself. Blackthorn Hall did not feel like home. It felt like a place that had been waiting too long in silence. Near 3 in the morning, the fire finally collapsed into ash. The room grew colder immediately. Evelina rose slowly from the chair and crossed toward the windows. Beyond the glass, the estate disappeared beneath layers of silver fog rolling over the distant hills. Bare trees twisted against the horizon like black veins beneath the storm clouds. Somewhere below, a lantern moved slowly across the courtyard. A stable hand beginning his work before sunrise. The world continued as though nothing impossible had happened upstairs. Behind her, the chamber door opened quietly. Evelina stiffened before turning. A woman entered carrying a silver tray with tea service balanced carefully between both hands. She appeared to be near 60. Thin. Severe. Dressed entirely in dark gray. Her white hair was pulled tightly beneath a lace cap. She closed the door behind her without making unnecessary noise. Good morning, Your Grace. Evelina struggled briefly with the title before realizing the woman addressed her. The sensation felt strange against her skin, like borrowed clothing that did not belong to her. Good morning. The older woman set the tray upon the table beside the fireplace. Her sharp eyes moved once across the untouched wedding chamber, the unworn bed, the extinguished fire, the open velvet box. Then her expression smoothed perfectly blank again. "I am Mrs. Weatherby," she said. "I oversee the household." Evelina nodded slightly. Mrs. Weatherby poured tea with precise movements. "His Grace has already left for the East grounds." "At this hour?" "The Duke rises before dawn every morning." Evelina accepted the teacup carefully. The porcelain warmed her fingers. "Does he always leave during storms?" "His Grace does many things most men avoid." The answer came calmly, without criticism, without admiration either. Mrs. Weatherby glanced briefly toward the necklace still resting beside the velvet box. For the first time, something shifted faintly in her controlled expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Then it vanished. Evelina noticed anyway. "You have seen this before." Mrs. Weatherby became still. "No, Your Grace." The denial arrived too quickly. Evelina lowered her gaze toward the tea. Steam curled softly upward between them. "You do not need to fear me." Mrs. Weatherby folded her hands neatly before her apron. "Fear has very little to do with this house." The statement lingered quietly in the room. Evelina looked toward her again. "Then what does?" Another pause. The older woman seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. "Memory." Somewhere deep below them, a grandfather clock struck for slow chimes. Mrs. Weatherby moved toward the wardrobe near the wall. "Breakfast will be served in the blue dining room at 8. His Grace prefers punctuality. Will he join me?" "The Duke always takes breakfast alone." The answer should not have disappointed her. Yet something inside Evelina tightened slightly all the same. Mrs. Weatherby opened the wardrobe doors. Inside hung rows of gowns already prepared in Evelina's measurements. Day dresses, evening gowns, riding coats, gloves, silk slippers arranged carefully along the shelves beneath. Evelina stared without speaking. "These arrived 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Weatherby said quietly. "His Grace personally approved every selection." Evelina moved closer slowly. Her fingertips brushed across a dark green riding coat lined with velvet. She had never owned clothing of this quality in her life. The stitching alone probably cost more than her father once earned in a month. Her chest tightened again at the thought of him. Jonathan Whitcomb had not looked at her during the wedding ceremony. Not once. He had signed the marriage papers with shaking hands and avoided her eyes afterward while counting the Duke's payment through the study doors. Evelina remembered standing alone beside the chapel steps while guests whispered behind folded fans. One woman had murmured softly enough to sound sympathetic. "Poor child." Another answered, "Poor or fortunate? That depends entirely on what the Duke wants from her." Evelina had not known the answer then. She knew even less now. Mrs. Weatherby closed the wardrobe gently. "The staff has prepared rooms for your personal use in the West Wing." "Separate from the Duke?" "Yes, Your Grace." Again the answer arrived too quickly. Evelina walked slowly back toward the small table near the fireplace. She lifted the necklace once more, letting the silver chain slide silently between her fingers. "Did my mother ever live here?" Mrs. Weatherby's face became unreadable. "I believe that is a conversation His Grace intends to have himself." "That is not an answer." "No," the older woman met her gaze directly for the first time. "It is not." The honesty unsettled Evelina more than avoidance would have. Outside the windows, dawn finally began pushing weak gray light through the fog. Blackthorn Hall emerged slowly from darkness. Endless stone corridors, iron gates, towers disappearing into clouds. The estate looked less like a home than a fortress built to preserve something dangerous. Mrs. Weatherby moved toward the door before pausing once more. "One thing, Your Grace." Evelina looked up. "Do not enter the East Wing after sunset." The words were spoken carefully, not dramatically. That made them worse. Evelina kept her expression neutral. "Why?" Mrs. Weatherby rested her hand lightly against the door handle. "Because some doors in this house were locked for a reason." Then she left without another word. The chamber became silent again. Evelina remained motionless beside the fire. The necklace rested cold against her skin while morning light slowly spread across the floorboards. Somewhere inside the enormous house, a door closed softly in the distance. Then another. Blackthorn Hall was waking around her. And for the first time since arriving, Evelina began to understand that she had not been brought here simply to become a duchess. She had been brought here because something inside this house belonged to her long before she ever knew its name. Breakfast at Blackthorn Hall began without conversation and ended the same way. Evelina entered the blue dining room precisely at 8 as instructed. The long chamber overlooked the northern gardens through enormous arched windows streaked pale silver with morning fog. Soft light spread across the polished table where a single place setting had already been prepared near the far end. The Duke was absent. A footman stood silently beside the wall. Another servant poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups without raising his eyes. Everything inside the room operated with the smooth precision of habit. Evelina noticed immediately that nobody seemed surprised by her presence. That unsettled her more than open curiosity would have. She removed her gloves carefully before taking her seat. The dark green morning dress Mrs. Weatherby had selected fit perfectly despite never having been measured. The realization lingered unpleasantly at the edge of her thoughts. Across from her rested a folded newspaper from London. The ink was still fresh enough to stain fingertips. Evelina glanced down automatically. Her stomach tightened almost immediately. Blackthorn Duke weds bankrupt merchant's daughter. The article continued beneath in smaller print. Society had always adored humiliation when wrapped in expensive silk. She forced herself to continue reading. Several paragraphs described Lucien Ravenshade as one of the wealthiest and most mysterious noblemen in England. Others focused entirely upon her father's debts. One sentence in particular remained fixed in her mind. The bride appeared composed despite widespread speculation regarding the unusual financial negotiations preceding the marriage. Negotiations. Evelina lowered the paper slowly. Even now they avoided the word sold. The footman approached quietly. "Would your grace prefer tea or coffee this morning?" "Tea, please." "Yes, your grace." The title still sounded unnatural, like a role someone else had forgotten to reclaim. A second newspaper rested near the center of the table. This one older. Folded deliberately. Evelina noticed her own name written lightly across the top corner in dark ink. Her pulse slowed. She reached toward it carefully. Inside was a small article dated nearly 15 years earlier. Missing child reported near Ashworth Forest. Evelina stared at the lines without blinking. A young girl approximately 6 years of age vanished during severe winter weather near the northern riding paths 3 miles east of Blackthorn Lands. Her fingertips tightened slightly against the page. The details continued. The child was recovered several hours later near the river crossing with no memory of how she arrived there. Evelina stopped reading. Cold moved slowly through her chest. She remembered the river. Or pieces of it. Snow falling sideways through dark trees. A lantern somewhere far away. Wet boots. A hand lifting her from the ground. Then emptiness afterward. Her father had told the story many times throughout her childhood. He always laughed softly while telling it. "You wandered too far and frightened your poor mother half to death." But the article said something else. Recovered near Blackthorn Lands. Evelina looked toward the servants instinctively. None of them appeared interested in her reaction. Yet the silence inside the room no longer felt accidental. Felt supervised. The dining room doors opened suddenly. Every servant straightened at once. Lucien entered wearing a dark riding coat still damp from morning fog. Black leather gloves rested in one hand. His boots carried traces of wet earth across the marble floor. The entire room shifted around his presence without noise or instruction. Evelina lowered the newspaper immediately. Lucien noticed anyway. He always seemed to notice. He crossed toward the table with measured steps and finally took the seat opposite her. "You found the article." It was not a question. Evelina folded the paper carefully. "You left it here for me." Lucien removed his gloves slowly. "Yes." The footman moved forward to pour coffee for the Duke. Lucien did not acknowledge him. Evelina watched the steam rise between them. "Why are you showing me these things?" "Because you deserve the truth." "Then tell it plainly." His eyes lifted toward hers. Gray. Steady. Difficult to read. Plain truths are rarely survivable inside this house. The answer irritated her more than she expected. Evelina placed the newspaper beside her untouched breakfast plate. I do not enjoy riddles, Your Grace. No, his expression remained calm. You enjoy certainty. The observation landed too precisely. Evelina looked away first. A brief silence settled between them while servants moved quietly around the room. Lucien reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He removed a small brass key and placed it beside her teacup. Old, heavy, ornately carved. What opens this? She asked. The West Tower Library. Evelina frowned faintly. Why would I need access to that? Because your mother spent most of her time there. Her fingers became still against the porcelain saucer. Lucien lifted his coffee calmly. You asked yesterday whether she lived here. Evelina stared at him. You knew her. Yes. How? The Duke remained silent for several seconds, not avoiding the answer. Measuring it. Your mother arrived at Blackthorn Hall when she was 19 years old. Evelina's heartbeat quickened slightly. As what? As a governess to my younger sister. The room seemed quieter suddenly. Even the servants moved more carefully now, as though they understood danger before it fully arrived. Evelina kept her voice controlled. My father never mentioned this. Your father omitted many things. Lucien took another slow drink of coffee, including the fact that your mother disappeared from Blackthorn Hall 3 months before her marriage. Evelina felt the words physically, not sharp enough to wound, heavy enough to alter balance. Disappeared. Without explanation. Her throat tightened. You expect me to believe my mother abandoned this estate and never spoke of it again? No, Lucien set down the coffee cup gently. I expect you to eventually question why she was never allowed to return. Silence followed, thick and cold. Evelina became aware of the clock ticking softly near the fireplace. Somewhere beyond the windows, wind moved through the iron gates surrounding the northern gardens. Her mind drifted unwillingly toward childhood memories she had not touched in years. Her mother standing beside the kitchen window after dark, quiet for long periods without explanation. The way she sometimes stared northward during winter storms. The strange lullaby she used to sing beneath her breath. Not a village song. Something older. More formal. Evelina swallowed slowly. What happened to her here? Lucien looked directly at her. For the first time since their wedding night, something almost human moved briefly across his expression. Regret. Then it vanished. That, he said quietly, is the reason I married you. Evelina remained in the dining room long after Lucien left. The untouched breakfast had gone cold beside her plate. Outside the windows, the fog had finally begun lifting from the northern gardens, exposing narrow stone paths lined with winter roses already stripped pale by frost. Somewhere beyond the hedges, workers moved across the estate carrying tools and bundles of firewood through the damp morning air. Life at Blackthorn Hall continued with unsettling calm, as though revelations belonged to ordinary routine here. The brass library key remained beside her teacup, heavy, waiting. Evelina stared at it for several moments before finally slipping it into the pocket of her dress. Mrs. Weatherby appeared precisely 10 minutes later, as though summoned by invisible timing rather than servants or bells. His Grace has departed for the lower village, she said quietly. He does not expect to return before evening. Evelina folded the newspaper carefully. Does he always leave without explanation? The Duke rarely explains himself to anyone. Mrs. Weatherby's gaze lowered briefly toward the pocket where the brass key now rested hidden beneath the fabric. You intend to visit the library. It was not phrased as a question. Evelina stood slowly from the table. You already knew I would. Most people would have waited. I am beginning to understand that waiting is dangerous in this house. Something unreadable crossed the older woman's face. Not disagreement. Recognition, perhaps. She stepped aside from the doorway. The West Tower staircase is beyond the upper gallery. Evelina paused. You are not going to stop me? Mrs. Weatherby looked toward the fog outside the windows before answering. Some truths become more dangerous when delayed. The upper gallery stretched across the eastern side of Blackthorn Hall, like a corridor inside a cathedral. Tall windows cast pale gray light across marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the chandeliers overhead. Portraits lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Generations of raven-shade ancestors watched silently from gilded frames. Men in military coats. Women draped in silk and pearls. Every face carried the same distant restraint. The same cold inheritance. Evelina moved slowly through the corridor. Her footsteps echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Halfway down the gallery she stopped before a portrait larger than the others. A woman stood beside a lake beneath a storm-dark sky. Her dark hair lifted slightly in the painted wind. One hand rested against the collar of a deep blue coat. Her expression was calm, intelligent, familiar enough to disturb something deep inside Evelina's chest. A brass plaque beneath the frame read Lady Aurora Ashcombe, 1788 to 1812. Evelina's breath slowed. Ashcombe, not Whitcomb, not even close. She stepped nearer without realizing she had moved. The woman's eyes were the exact shade as her own. Not similar. Exact. A floorboard creaked quietly behind her. Evelina turned sharply. A young maid stood several feet away clutching folded linens against her chest. She looked no older than 17. Frightened blue eyes widened immediately. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I did not mean to startle you." Evelina glanced once more toward the portrait. Who was Lady Aurora? The girl visibly hesitated. "I should not speak about the old family portraits. I am asking." Another pause. Then the maid lowered her voice carefully. "They say she was meant to marry into the family many years ago." Evelina looked back toward the painting. Meant to. Before she disappeared. Cold moved slowly through her arms. Disappeared where? No one knows. The girl's voice became quieter still. But servants still talk about the winter she vanished from the estate. Evelina's pulse quickened faintly. How long ago? Nearly 20 years. The timing settled heavily between them. Before Evelina could ask another question, footsteps approached from the far corridor. The maid immediately lowered her head and hurried away without another word. A second later, a woman emerged from the eastern archway. Tall, elegant, dressed entirely in deep burgundy velvet despite the early hour. Her silver blonde hair was arranged flawlessly beneath a feathered hat. She carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to control. Her pale eyes landed upon Evelina instantly, then moved toward the portrait behind her. The woman smiled faintly, not warmly. "So you found Aurora already?" Evelina straightened carefully. "And you are?" "Lady Veronica Ashmere." The woman removed her gloves one finger at a time. "Lucian's sister-in-law." Evelina recognized the name immediately. Mrs. Weatherby had mentioned it only once. Carefully, Veronica approached with slow measured grace. "I arrived this morning after hearing my dear brother-in-law had suddenly taken a bride." Her gaze traveled briefly across Evelina's face. "Studying. Measuring. You are younger than I expected." Evelina kept her expression calm. "I imagine disappointment is difficult at your age." Veronica's smile sharpened almost invisibly. "Interesting." Silence stretched briefly beneath the portraits. Evelina noticed that Lady Veronica never once looked surprised to find her standing before Aurora Ashcombe's painting. "You knew her," Evelina said quietly. Veronica's eyes returned to the portrait. "Everyone in this house knew Aurora. Then perhaps you can explain why she looks exactly like me." Veronica became still for one brief second. Only one. Then her composure returned perfectly smooth. "People often resemble distant relatives. She was related to me? Was she not?" The answer arrived too quickly. Deliberately careless. Evelina understood at once that Veronica already knew far more than she intended to say. Lady Veronica moved closer to the painting. "Lucian always had a weakness for ghosts." "What does that mean?" "Only that he dislikes unfinished things." Veronica adjusted one of her gloves calmly. "And your arrival has reopened matters better left buried." Evelina felt the warning beneath the softness. "You sound concerned." "I am practical." Veronica turned slightly toward the staircase leading upward into the tower shadows. Blackthorn Hall survives because certain truths remain locked away. Her eyes flickered toward Evelina again. "You should consider whether you truly wish to open them." Before Evelina could answer, Veronica's gaze shifted suddenly past her shoulder toward the western corridor. The change was subtle but immediate. Controlled irritation. Evelina turned instinctively. Lucien stood at the far end of the gallery. He had returned silently enough that neither woman heard his approach. Rain darkened the shoulders of his black coat. One gloved hand rested lightly against his cane. His expression revealed nothing at all. Yet the entire corridor seemed colder around him. Veronica smiled immediately. Beautiful. Artificial. Lucien. I did not expect you back so soon. Clearly. His voice remained calm. Veronica folded her gloves together. I was merely welcoming your new Duchess. Lucien's eyes moved once toward the portrait behind Evelina, then toward the brass library key barely visible through the fabric of her pocket. He noticed everything. You should not disturb her on her first morning here, he said quietly. Veronica tilted her head slightly. Disturbance appears unavoidable in this family. Lucien did not answer. The silence itself dismissed her. After several long seconds, Veronica smiled once more toward Evelina. We shall speak again soon. Then she walked away down the eastern corridor, her velvet skirts whispering softly against marble floors until she disappeared beyond the archway. Evelina looked toward Lucien. She knows something. Yes. About my mother. Yes. The directness surprised her. Lucien approached slowly until he stood beside the portrait of Aurora Ashcombe. For the first time, Evelina noticed something strange beneath the painting's frame. Fresh scratches along the brass mounting hooks, as though the portrait had recently been removed and rehung. Lucien's gaze remained fixed upon the woman in the painting. Someone entered this gallery last night after midnight, he said quietly. Evelina felt her pulse shift. How do you know? His eyes lowered briefly toward the scratches beneath the frame. Because that portrait was moved. The corridor became very still around them. Then Lucien looked directly at her. And whoever moved it wanted you to see her immediately. Lucien did not explain further. That became increasingly clear to Evelina over the next several hours. Questions entered the air around him and disappeared unanswered, as though Blackthorn Hall itself swallowed them before they could fully exist. He escorted her neither toward the library nor away from it. Instead, he simply turned from the portrait gallery and walked down the western corridor with the calm certainty of a man who expected to be followed. Evelina hesitated only briefly before doing exactly that. The corridor narrowed as they moved deeper into the older sections of the estate. Candle sconces replaced chandeliers. Dark wood replaced marble. The air smelled faintly of dust, cedar, and something older she could not identify. Rain had returned outside, soft at first, then steadier against the high narrow windows lining the passage. Lucien finally stopped before a heavy oak door reinforced with black iron hinges. He removed a second key from his coat and unlocked it himself. The mechanism clicked deeply inside the wall. Old. Complicated. The West Tower Library has remained closed for 11 years, he said quietly. Evelina looked toward him sharply. Since my mother died. Yes. He opened the door. Warm air drifted outward carrying the scent of paper and extinguished fireplaces. Evelina stepped inside slowly. The library occupied an enormous circular chamber stretching upward through 3 floors of towering bookshelves connected by iron staircases and narrow walkways. Tall windows curved along the outer wall overlooking the cliffs beyond Blackthorn Lands. Gray daylight filtered weakly through the rain, painting pale silver patterns across worn carpets and dark wooden desks. A massive chandelier hung overhead like frozen candlelight trapped beneath dust. Evelina stopped near the center of the room. Something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly. Not fear this time. Recognition. The sensation arrived so quickly she nearly turned to leave. One side of the library remained untouched by dust entirely. Fresh flowers stood in a crystal vase beside a leather reading chair. Firewood had recently been stacked beside the hearth. Someone maintained this room carefully despite its supposed closure. Evelina moved toward the nearest bookshelf. Her fingertips brushed lightly across rows of leather-bound volumes. History, astronomy, poetry, French philosophy, classical music compositions. Every shelf reflected intelligence rather than decoration. She paused before noticing a smaller section near the eastern wall. Children's books. Her breathing slowed. Lucien remained near the doorway watching her quietly. She read to you here when you were very young. Evelina turned sharply. I have never been here before. No, his gaze remained steady. But she brought you here. The words unsettled the room itself. Evelina looked again toward the shelves, toward the reading chair beside the fire, toward the small blue blanket folded neatly across its armrest. Suddenly another memory flickered through her mind. A woman's voice reading softly beside rain against glass. The scent of cedar smoke. Her own small hands holding silver thread against dark fabric. Then nothing again. The memory vanished before she could fully grasp it. Evelina pressed her fingers lightly against the bookshelf until the dizziness passed. You keep speaking as though my childhood happened inside this house. Part of it did. My father said we lived near the river my entire life. Your father said many things. Frustration moved sharply beneath her calm now. Then stopped speaking in pieces. Her voice echoed faintly upward through the library towers. Tell me what happened. Lucien studied her silently for several seconds. Outside, thunder rolled low across the cliffs. Your mother came to Blackthorn Hall 19 years ago, he said at last. She was intelligent, educated, far too independent for the society she was born into. Evelina remained motionless. My father was not part of society. No, Lucien's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. He entered her life later. He walked slowly toward the fireplace while speaking. Aurora Ashcombe was engaged to my older brother. Evelina felt the words physically, like cold water moving slowly beneath skin. Your brother. Edward Ravenshade. Lucien stared briefly into the empty hearth. He died 6 months before the wedding. Silence settled heavily between them. Evelina glanced instinctively toward the portrait-sized windows where rain streaked the glass in silver lines. My mother never mentioned any of this. She was forbidden to. The answer came immediately. Evelina looked back toward him. By who? Lucien's jaw tightened slightly. My father. Something shifted in the room then. Not visible. Felt. Evelina realized suddenly that nearly every painful silence surrounding Blackthorn Hall seemed to lead back toward the previous Duke. A man already dead, yet still controlling the house long after burial. Lucien moved toward a writing desk near the center of the library. He opened one drawer and removed a thin leather journal tied with faded ribbon. Your mother kept this during her final months here. Evelina stared at the journal without taking it. Why are you giving this to me now? Because someone else has already begun searching the house. His gray eyes lifted toward hers. And if they find these first, you will never know who you are. A cold sensation passed through her arms. You think Lady Veronica is searching for them. I know she is. Evelina accepted the journal carefully. The leather felt worn smooth with age. Initials pressed faintly into the cover caught the weak light from the windows. A. She opened the first page slowly. The handwriting matched the note from the velvet box exactly. Elegant. Controlled. Familiar in ways that made her chest ache unexpectedly. October 14, 1801. Blackthorn Hall does not frighten me. But the silence inside this family does. Evelina swallowed carefully and continued reading. Lord Ravenshade watches everything. Lucien watches nothing, which is far more dangerous. The words blurred briefly before her eyes. She looked up. She wrote about you. Lucien's face revealed almost nothing. Yet he did not look surprised. Yes. You knew she kept this. I was the one who hid it. Another silence followed. Rain continued softly beyond the tower windows while shadows lengthened across the circular room. Evelina lowered her gaze back toward the journal pages. Several entries farther inside. One sentence had been underlined heavily enough to nearly tear the paper. If anything happens to me, they must never take Evelina away from Blackthorn. Her breath caught slightly. What does that mean? Lucien crossed slowly toward the windows overlooking the cliffs. It means your mother believed you were in danger before you were even born. Evelina stared at him. From who? He did not answer immediately. Outside, lightning flashed pale across the distant sea far below the cliffs. For one brief second, the entire library illuminated silver white. Then darkness settled again. Lucien finally turned back toward her. From the Ravenshade family itself. The storm intensified after sunset. Wind moved violently against the tower windows while rain lashed the cliffs below Blackthorn Hall in silver sheets. Evelina remained inside the library long after Lucian departed. The leather journal rested open upon the desk before her, its pages filled with fragments of a woman she no longer recognized entirely as her mother. Aurora Ashcombe did not write like Catherine Whitcomb. The difference unsettled her more deeply with every page. Catherine Whitcomb had spoken softly, dressed simply, and apologized too often even inside her own home. Aurora Ashcombe wrote with precision, confidence, defiance carefully hidden beneath elegant sentences. Evelina turned another page slowly. February 2, 1802. Edward says the house has eyes. Lucian says the house has memory. I do not yet know which brother frightens me more. Evelina stared at the line for several moments. The candles near the desk flickered as thunder rolled across the sea beyond the cliffs. Somewhere below the tower, a door slammed shut in the wind. She continued reading. Lord Ravenshade grows more suspicious every day. He watches the servants. He questions the letters arriving from London. Yesterday he demanded to know whether I had entered the West Archives alone. I told him no. That was the first lie I have spoken since arriving here. Evelina closed her eyes briefly. The previous Duke had already begun to form inside her mind as something larger than a difficult aristocrat. The journal transformed him into atmosphere rather than man. Cold hallways, locked rooms, conversations ending abruptly when footsteps approached. She suddenly understood why every servant lowered their voices inside this house. Fear could survive generations when properly maintained. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. Evelina looked up immediately. The library door opened before she answered. Lucian entered carrying a silver lantern in one hand. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his black coat once again. He paused near the entrance upon seeing the journal still open before her. You should not remain in the tower during storms. Evelina looked back toward the pages. My mother did. Lucian crossed toward the windows overlooking the cliffs. Your mother ignored most warnings. Did she die because of that? Silence followed. Not avoidance this time. Calculation. Evelina had begun recognizing the difference. Lucian removed his gloves slowly. No, the single word settled heavily into the room. Evelina closed the journal carefully. Then how did she die? Lightning flashed outside. White light flooded briefly across the library walls before fading again into shadow. Lucian remained turned toward the windows. You believe your mother died from illness because that is the story your father chose. Evelina stood slowly from the desk. And the truth? Another silence. The storm pressed harder against the glass now. Somewhere below the cliffs, waves crashed violently against rock. Lucian finally faced her again. Aurora Ashcombe disappeared from Blackthorn Hall on December 19, 1803. Evelina felt her pulse shift. You said she left before marrying my father. She did. Then how was I born afterward? Lucian's eyes remained fixed steadily upon hers. Because she was already pregnant when she vanished. The room became very still. Evelina stared at him without breathing for one brief second. You believe Edward Ravenshade was my father? No, the answer arrived immediately. Certain. I know he was not. Confusion moved sharply through her chest. Then who? Lucian looked toward the journal resting between them. That is what my father spent years trying to discover. Evelina stepped back from the desk slowly. You are telling me the Duke of Blackthorn hunted my mother because she was carrying a child? Not hunted. Lucian's expression darkened faintly. Contained. The word chilled her completely. Thunder shook the windows overhead. Evelina crossed toward the fireplace instinctively, needing distance from both the storm and the conversation. Why would a child matter this much? Lucian followed more slowly. Because Blackthorn Hall was built upon inheritance. His voice remained calm, controlled. And inheritance makes people dangerous. Evelina stared into the empty hearth. My father was a merchant. Poor. Ordinary. Your father became poor afterward. She turned sharply. Lucian continued quietly. Jonathan Whitcomb appeared in Northern society 6 months after Aurora disappeared. Suddenly married. Suddenly employed. Suddenly able to purchase property far beyond his previous means. Evelina remembered her childhood home instantly. The narrow river cottage with expensive furniture that never matched the rest of the house. The silver dining set her mother polished personally every Sunday. The locked drawer in her father's study that contained old gold coins bearing unfamiliar crests. She had never questioned any of it before. You think he was paid? I think your father accepted something in exchange for silence. Lightning flashed again. Lucien's face sharpened briefly beneath white light before darkness reclaimed it. Evelina folded her arms tightly against herself. Why are you telling me this now? Because someone else already knows. Her heartbeat slowed dangerously. Lady Veronica. Yes. Lucien moved toward the desk and lifted the journal carefully. Veronica married my older brother 12 years ago. She understands this family better than anyone alive. His fingers tightened slightly against the worn leather cover. And she has spent the last decade searching for whatever Aurora left behind. Evelina looked toward the journal immediately. This. Part of it. Lucien placed the journal back upon the desk. Your mother hid several things before disappearing. What things? Documents. Letters. One key. Evelina became still. Another key. Lucien's gaze lifted toward her pocket where the brass library key remained hidden beneath the fabric of her dress. There are 4 in total. A strange sensation moved through Evelina then. Not fear. Pattern. As though invisible pieces had slowly begun aligning beneath the surface of everything around her. The necklace. The portrait. The journal. The keys. None of it felt random anymore. My mother expected someone to continue this after her death. Lucien did not answer immediately. Outside the storm raged harder across the cliffs. Your mother expected you. Evelina looked at him carefully. You speak as though she planned all of this. Perhaps she did. The answer disturbed her more than any revelation so far. She moved slowly toward the nearest window overlooking the sea. Rain distorted the cliffs into shifting gray shadows beneath the night sky. Then why did she never tell me anything? Lucien's reflection appeared behind her in the dark glass. Tall. Motionless. Watching. Because she believed the less you knew, the longer you would survive. The words settled deeply into the silence between them. Evelina lowered her gaze toward the black waves crashing far below the cliffs. Suddenly another memory surfaced without warning. Her mother kneeling beside her childhood bed one winter night. Candlelight flickering softly across tired features. A whisper against her hair. If anyone ever asks who you belong to, tell them nobody. Evelina's fingers tightened slowly against the cold stone window frame. At the time she had believed it was comfort. Now it sounded like instruction. Behind her, Lucien crossed toward the library door. Lock this room when you leave tonight. Evelina turned slightly. Why? His hand rested upon the iron handle. Because the moment Veronica learns you have the journal, she will begin searching your rooms. Then he left her alone with the storm, the journal, and the terrible realization that her mother had not simply hidden the truth from her. She had buried Evelina inside it. Evelina locked the library exactly as Lucien instructed. The iron mechanism turned heavily beneath the brass key, echoing through the tower staircase like something sealing shut beneath water. She stood motionless for several seconds afterward with one hand still resting against the cold handle. Rain continued hammering the windows above her. Somewhere deep below the tower, Blackthorn Hall groaned softly beneath the storm winds moving across the cliffs. The house never truly sounded empty. It breathed, remembered, waited. Evelina descended the narrow staircase slowly, the leather journal hidden beneath her shawl against her ribs. Every shadow along the corridor seemed sharper now, every portrait more watchful. The revelations from the library had altered the shape of the house around her. She no longer felt like a stranger wandering through another family's estate. She felt like someone returning to a place where her absence had once mattered. That frightened her more. Halfway through the upper gallery, she noticed light beneath the door of the music room. Soft gold spilled across the marble floor in a thin line. Evelina slowed instinctively. Earlier that morning, the chamber had been dark and locked. Now faint piano notes drifted through the corridor. Slow, precise, familiar in a way she could not explain. She should have continued walking. Instead, she stopped beside the door. The melody reached her more clearly now. A quiet classical piece played with restrained elegance. Not performance. Memory. Her pulse shifted unexpectedly. She knew this song. Not from concerts or village gatherings. From childhood. A woman humming softly beside a rainy window. Evelina pushed the door open carefully. The music stopped immediately. Lady Veronica sat alone at the grand piano beneath candlelight. Her pale fingers rested motionless against the ivory keys. She turned her head slowly toward Evelina without visible surprise. I wondered how long it would take you to follow the music. Evelina remained near the doorway. You were expecting me. Veronica smiled faintly. No. I was expecting Aurora. The answer unsettled the room instantly. Candlelight flickered across the polished black piano while thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the eastern wing. Veronica closed the lid gently over the keys. You look more like her every hour. Evelina said nothing. Veronica studied her quietly for several moments before speaking again. Did Lucien finally show you the tower library? Evelina kept her expression neutral. Why would you assume that? Because he never brings anyone there unless he is desperate. Veronica rose gracefully from the piano bench. The deep burgundy silk of her gown moved softly across the carpet as she approached. And Lucien has been desperate for a very long time. Evelina tightened her hold subtly against the hidden journal beneath her shawl. Veronica noticed. Her pale eyes flickered downward briefly before returning to Evelina's face. You already found something. Silence followed. Evelina understood suddenly that Lady Veronica missed very little. You speak as though this concerns you personally, she said carefully. Veronica stopped beside the fireplace. Everything at Blackthorn concerns me personally. Her gaze shifted toward the rain-dark windows. Especially unfinished tragedies. Evelina studied her in the candlelight. Beautiful women often appeared harmless when they smiled softly enough. Veronica understood that better than most. Did you know my mother well? Veronica's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not warmth. Something more complicated. Aurora was impossible not to know. Lucien said she was engaged to Edward Ravenshade. Yes. Veronica folded her hands lightly before her. Edward adored her. And Lucien? Another pause. Then Veronica looked directly at her. Lucien understood her. The distinction settled heavily into the room. Evelina became aware once again of the melody still lingering faintly inside her memory. The song you were playing, she said quietly. My mother taught it to me when I was little. Veronica's fingers became still against her gloves. Interesting. Why? Because Aurora only ever played that piece for one person. Thunder cracked sharply overhead. The windows trembled briefly beneath the storm. Evelina felt her heartbeat slow. Who? Veronica walked slowly toward the piano again. Lucien. The answer arrived gently. Almost kindly. That made it worse. Evelina stared at her without speaking. Veronica rested one hand lightly against the polished black surface of the instrument. Your mother spent years pretending she belonged to Edward. Her pale eyes lifted carefully toward Evelina. But houses notice certain things. So do women. Evelina felt the room narrow slightly around her. You are implying my mother loved the wrong brother. I am implying nothing. Veronica smiled faintly again. I am remembering. Silence settled between them while rain lashed the windows harder outside. Evelina suddenly understood why Lucien never spoke directly about Aurora Ashcombe. Some griefs changed shape when spoken aloud. Did my mother leave Blackthorn willingly? She asked at last. Veronica looked toward the fire. No woman ever leaves this house willingly. The answer disturbed Evelina enough that she took one unconscious step backward. Veronica noticed immediately. Do not look so frightened, dear. Her voice softened almost affectionately. You are far safer here than you were with Jonathan Whitcomb. Evelina's eyes sharpened. You knew my father. Briefly. Veronica moved toward the side table beside the piano and poured herself wine from a crystal decanter. A weak man. Easily influenced. Men like that often mistake survival for intelligence. Evelina folded her arms carefully. Lucien believes my father was paid to hide me. Veronica lifted the wine glass slowly. Your father was paid to disappear. The room became silent again. Evelina stared at her. By who? Veronica took a slow sip before answering. By the previous duke. Cold moved sharply through Evelina's chest. Why? Veronica lowered the glass. Because your existence complicated inheritance. The same phrase Lucien had used earlier. Inheritance. As though her entire life reduced itself repeatedly to property, bloodlines, and locked rooms. Evelina looked toward the storm-dark windows. What exactly am I supposed to inherit? Veronica watched her carefully now, measuring every reaction. That, she said softly, is the one question Lucien refuses to answer. Footsteps echoed suddenly in the corridor outside the music room. Heavy. Measured. Veronica's expression changed instantly. Not fear. Calculation. A second later, Lucien appeared in the doorway. Water still darkened his coat from the storm outside. His gray eyes moved first toward Evelina, then toward Veronica standing beside the wine table. The atmosphere inside the room tightened immediately. You should not be alone with her, Lucien said calmly. Veronica smiled without warmth. You say that as though I bite. Only when cornered. Evelina noticed something then. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, Lucien's composure carried visible strain beneath it. Not anger exactly. Vigilance. Veronica seemed to recognize it too. She set down the wineglass untouched. Relax, Lucien. I have not told her the worst part yet. Silence. The storm pounded harder against the windows. Lucien's voice lowered dangerously. Veronica. She ignored the warning completely. Her pale eyes remained fixed upon Evelina. Did he tell you what happened the night Aurora disappeared? Evelina looked immediately toward Lucien. His jaw tightened. Veronica continued softly. Did he tell you your mother vanished from this house only 3 hours after Edward Ravenshade died? The room seemed to lose warmth instantly. Evelina stared at Lucien. Your brother died the same night? Lucien did not answer quickly enough. Veronica's smile faded entirely now. No one ever discovered whether Aurora fled because she was frightened. Her gaze sharpened toward Lucien. Or because someone helped her escape. Lightning flashed violently beyond the windows. For one brief second, every face inside the music room turned white beneath the storm light. Then darkness swallowed them again. Lucien stepped forward at last. Enough. Veronica held his gaze for several silent seconds before turning gracefully toward the door. As she passed Evelina, she paused briefly beside her shoulder. If you wish to survive this family, she whispered quietly, learn the difference between guilt and grief. One of them still owns your husband. Then she disappeared into the corridor, leaving only the fading scent of roses and rain behind her. Lucien did not speak until the music room door closed behind Veronica. The silence she left behind felt heavier than her presence had. Rain battered the windows in uneven bursts, while candlelight trembled softly across the polished piano. Evelina remained motionless near the center of the room with Veronica's final words still echoing through her mind. Guilt and grief. One of them still owns your husband. She looked toward Lucien carefully. He stood near the doorway with one hand resting against the dark wood frame, his expression unreadable beneath the storm shadows. Yet something about him seemed more tired now. Not physically. Older than that. Is she lying? Evelina asked quietly. Lucien removed his gloves slowly before answering. Veronica rarely lies outright. Then Edward died the same night my mother disappeared. Yes. The answer arrived without hesitation this time. Evelina folded her arms tightly beneath her shawl. How? Lucien's eyes lowered briefly toward the marble floor. Horse accident. The explanation sounded practiced, worn thin through repetition. Evelina noticed immediately. You do not believe that. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the rain-dark windows. Belief is irrelevant. Not to me. She stepped closer before she realized she had moved. You married me because of whatever happened that night. You brought me here because my mother vanished after your brother died. And now everyone in this house speaks as though I inherited some unfinished disaster. Her voice remained controlled. That made the anger beneath it sharper. I deserve more than fragments. Lucien watched her silently for several seconds. Then he crossed slowly toward the fireplace near the piano. The fire had nearly burned itself low. Orange embers glowed faintly beneath darkening ash. Edward died near the northern cliffs, he said quietly. His horse returned alone just after midnight. Evelina listened without interrupting. The storm that night was worse than this one. Search parties found him at dawn beneath the eastern ridge. His voice remained calm. Too calm. And my mother? Lucian stared into the fire. Aurora disappeared 3 hours earlier. Evelina felt cold move slowly through her chest. Was she with him? Another silence. No one knows. She studied his face carefully. But you think she was? Lucian did not answer. That was answer enough. Thunder rolled deeply through the walls around them. Evelina looked toward the dark piano keys reflecting candlelight like black water. Did people believe she killed him? Lucian's expression changed slightly then. Not shock. Memory. Some did. And you? He lifted his gaze toward her at last. Gray eyes. Steady. Tired in ways she was only beginning to understand. No, the certainty in the answer unsettled her unexpectedly. Why not? Lucian crossed toward the windows overlooking the storm-black gardens. Because Aurora feared my brother. Evelina became still. Feared him? Yes. The word landed softly inside the room. Evelina remembered the journal immediately. Edward says the house has eyes. Lucian says the house has memory. I do not yet know which brother frightens me more. She had assumed Aurora wrote playfully. Now she was no longer certain. What kind of man was Edward? Lucian remained facing the windows. Rain streaked silver across the glass behind him. Charismatic. That is not an answer. It is the answer society preferred. Evelina waited quietly. Eventually Lucian continued. Edward understood how to make people trust him. His voice lowered slightly. Even when they should not. A strange unease settled over the room. Evelina suddenly realized that nobody inside Blackthorn Hall ever described Edward directly. Not Veronica. Not Lucian. Not the journal. Everything around him felt blurred intentionally. Did my mother love him? She asked at last. Lucian's hand tightened once against the window frame before relaxing again. Aurora believed she did. The distinction mattered. Evelina heard it immediately. Before she could ask another question, rapid footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. The music room door opened abruptly. Mrs. Weatherby entered carrying a silver lantern, her normally controlled expression visibly strained. Your Grace. She looked directly toward Lucian. Someone entered the west tower. The atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. Lucian straightened. When? Within the last 15 minutes. Evelina felt the hidden journal beneath her shawl suddenly become heavier. Lucian noticed her reaction immediately. Did anyone see who it was? He asked. Mrs. Weatherby shook her head once. But the library door was unlocked when Thomas passed the staircase. Evelina's pulse slowed dangerously. She remembered locking it herself. Lucian crossed toward her without hesitation. The journal. Evelina removed it carefully from beneath her shawl. Lucian took it immediately. His movements remained calm but precise now. Urgent beneath control. Come with me. The three of them moved quickly through the upper corridors while thunder shook the estate overhead. Servants stepped silently aside as Lucian passed. No one asked questions. Blackthorn Hall seemed accustomed to tension arriving without explanation. By the time they reached the West Tower staircase, the storm had intensified enough that the windows rattled inside their frames. Mrs. Weatherby lifted the lantern higher as they climbed. Shadows twisted sharply across the stone walls. The library door stood partially open. Evelina stopped breathing for one brief second. She had locked it. Lucian pushed the door wider carefully. The circular chamber beyond appeared untouched at first glance. The candles still burned low near the desk. Rain lashed the tower windows. Bookshelves stretched upward into darkness exactly as before. Then Evelina noticed the chair near the fireplace overturned sideways upon the carpet. Lucian crossed the room immediately. His eyes moved rapidly across the shelves, the desk, the floor, measuring disturbance rather than damage. Mrs. Weatherby closed the library door behind them. Nothing appears missing, she whispered. Lucian said nothing. Evelina moved slowly toward the desk where Aurora's journal had rested earlier. Fresh scratches marked the wood surface near the drawers. Small. Recent. As though someone searched quickly. Then she saw it. One page torn cleanly from the center of the journal lying open in Lucian's hands. Her breath caught. That page was not missing before. Lucian's expression darkened completely now. He flipped carefully through the remaining pages. Evelina stepped closer. What was on it? Lucian remained silent too long. Finally he answered quietly. A list of names. What names? Another pause. Then his eyes lifted toward hers. The people Aurora believed were involved in Edward's death. Thunder cracked violently overhead at the exact moment the library windows burst inward. Glass shattered across the floor in a storm of rain and freezing wind. Mrs. Weatherby cried out sharply. Evelina turned instinctively toward the broken windows just as a dark figure disappeared beyond the tower balcony outside. Lucian moved instantly. Not recklessly. Efficiently. He crossed the room and pulled Evelina backward away from the shattered glass with one strong movement. Rain lashed violently through the broken window frames now, soaking the carpets and scattering loose papers across the library floor. Mrs. Weatherby struggled to shield the lantern flame from the wind. Evelina stared toward the balcony where the figure vanished into darkness beyond the cliffs. Someone was here. Lucian's grip remained firm against her arm. His voice lowered dangerously. No. He looked toward the torn journal page still clutched in his hand. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. The storm did not weaken until nearly dawn. Rain continued pouring through the shattered library windows while servants hurried silently across the tower carrying blankets, lanterns, and wooden boards to cover the broken glass. No one asked questions. Blackthorn Hall operated with the quiet efficiency of a household long accustomed to damaged things. Evelina stood near the fireplace wrapped in a heavy wool shawl Mrs. Weatherby had placed around her shoulders. The leather journal rested closed upon the desk now, its torn pages hidden once again beneath Lucian's hand. He had not allowed anyone else to touch it, not even her. That unsettled her more than the intruder itself. A man protecting answers often looked very similar to a man hiding them. Lucian remained near the windows speaking quietly with two estate guards while thunder rolled farther away across the cliffs. Evelina watched him carefully from across the room. His calm had changed since the break-in. Not vanished. Sharpened. Every movement more controlled now. More dangerous. Mrs. Weatherby approached carrying fresh candles. You should return to your rooms, Your Grace. Evelina glanced toward the shattered balcony doors. Wind still moved rainwater across the floorboards in silver streaks. Will they find whoever entered the tower? Mrs. Weatherby lowered the candles carefully onto the desk. Blackthorn Hall rarely loses people. The answer should have reassured her. Somehow it did not. Lucian dismissed the guards a few moments later. The heavy library doors closed behind them with deep finality. Silence settled slowly through the circular room again. Evelina looked toward him. You knew that page mattered. Lucian removed his wet gloves without responding immediately. Yes. And you knew someone would eventually come searching for it. Another pause. Then he answered quietly. I hoped I was wrong. Evelina stepped closer. Who was on the list? Lucian's gray eyes lifted toward hers. People Aurora believed were connected to Edward's death. You already said that. Her voice remained calm. I am asking for names. The storm winds rattled softly against the boarded windows behind him. Lucian studied her silently before finally opening the journal once more. There were 4 names. Evelina watched him carefully. One was Veronica. No visible surprise crossed his face. Yes. Who were the others? His fingers rested against the damaged page edges. My father. Cold moved sharply through her chest. And Lucian looked down briefly. Myself. Silence swallowed the room entirely. Evelina stared at him without blinking. Aurora believed you helped kill your own brother. No, his voice remained level. Aurora believed I knew something I refused to tell her. The distinction mattered. Evelina felt it immediately. Did you? Lucian crossed slowly toward the fireplace. Shadows moved sharply across his face beneath the flickering candlelight. Edward rode toward the cliffs shortly before midnight. He spoke quietly now, almost as though remembering alone. Aurora followed him. Evelina listened without interrupting. I found her horse near the eastern ridge an hour later. His jaw tightened faintly. But Aurora herself was gone. The fire cracked softly between them. And Edward. Dead by morning. Evelina folded her arms more tightly around the shawl. What did Aurora think you were hiding? Lucian looked toward the flames. That Edward did not fall accidentally. A strange heaviness settled through the library. Evelina realized suddenly that no one in this house actually believed the official story anymore. Perhaps they never had. Do you believe it? She asked. Lucian's answer came after a long silence. I believe Edward was afraid the night he died. Evelina felt her pulse slow. Afraid of what? Lucian finally looked directly at her again. Aurora. The answer shocked her enough that she took one small step backward. Lucian noticed immediately. Your mother changed during her final months at Blackthorn. His voice remained low and steady. She stopped trusting the family. She searched the archives alone. She asked questions about inheritance law, hidden bloodlines, old property claims. Evelina remembered the underlined sentence inside the journal. If anything happens to me, they must never take Evelina away from Blackthorn. Suddenly it sounded less like fear and more like preparation. She believed something was hidden here, Evelina whispered. Yes. Did she find it? Lucian did not answer. Outside the library, footsteps echoed suddenly through the tower corridor. Fast. Uneven. A second later the door opened sharply. A young footman stood breathless near the entrance, rainwater still clinging to his coat. Your Grace. He looked directly toward Lucian. They found someone near the eastern stables. Lucian became completely still. Who? Mr. Whitcomb, sir. Evelina felt the room tilt slightly beneath her balance. My father. The footman nodded nervously. He arrived just before dawn asking to see the Duchess. Silence followed. Deep. Dangerous. Lucian's expression revealed nothing at all now. That frightened Evelina more than anger would have. Where is he? In the lower drawing room, Your Grace. The footman hesitated briefly. He appears frightened. Evelina's pulse quickened sharply for the first time all night. Jonathan Whitcomb hated storms. He hated travel. He avoided Blackthorn lands entirely during her childhood. Yet somehow he had crossed 40 miles of rain and darkness to reach the estate before sunrise. Lucian dismissed the footman quietly. The library door closed once more. Evelina looked immediately toward him. You knew he would come. No. Then why do you look unsurprised? Lucian moved toward the desk and closed Aurora's journal carefully. Because frightened men return to old mistakes eventually. Evelina stared at him. You think my father came because of the missing journal page. I think your father came because someone else already found him first. Cold spread slowly through her chest. She remembered Veronica's words from the music room. Weak men mistake survival for intelligence. Lucian crossed toward her and stopped close enough that she could smell rainwater and cedar against his coat. Whatever Jonathan Whitcomb tells you this morning, he said quietly, remember one thing. Evelina held his gaze steadily. What? Lucian's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Your father has spent 19 years protecting himself. Thunder rolled faintly beyond the cliffs again. Much farther away now, yet somehow more dangerous. Evelina looked toward the closed library doors leading down toward the lower floors of Blackthorn Hall, where Jonathan Whitcomb waited below. Her childhood had always felt strangely incomplete. Small silences. Locked drawers. Stories that changed slightly each time they were repeated. Now every missing piece seemed to be climbing steadily toward her through the storm-dark halls of Blackthorn. And for the first time since arriving, Evelina realized she was no longer afraid of the truth itself. She was afraid of which version of it Lucian Ravenshade already knew. Jonathan Whitcomb looked smaller inside Blackthorn Hall than Evelina had ever seen him before. He stood near the fireplace in the lower drawing room wearing a rain-soaked coat wrinkled from travel and exhaustion. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his hat onto the marble floor beneath him. His graying hair clung damply against his forehead. The sharp confidence he usually carried around weaker men had vanished entirely. He kept glancing toward the tall windows as though expecting someone to appear beyond the storm-dark gardens. Evelina stopped near the doorway without speaking. For several long seconds her father did not notice her presence. Then he turned suddenly and froze. Relief crossed his face first. Immediate. Desperate. Evelina. He stepped forward quickly. Thank God. She remained where she was. You should not have come here. The words seemed to strike him physically. Jonathan slowed. I had no choice. Lucien entered the room behind her without sound. The atmosphere changed instantly. Jonathan noticed him immediately and became visibly rigid. Evelina had never seen her father frightened of another man before. Not openly. Lucien closed the drawing room doors himself. Mr. Whitcomb. His voice remained perfectly calm. You arrived earlier than expected. Jonathan swallowed once. I did not come for trouble. No. Lucien removed his gloves slowly. Trouble followed you. Silence settled heavily across the room. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while firelight moved across the walls in trembling gold reflections. Evelina studied her father carefully now. He looked older than he had only days earlier at the wedding. More fragile. As though the storm itself had stripped something away from him during the journey to Blackthorn. Why are you here? She asked quietly. Jonathan's eyes moved toward her immediately. You are not safe. Lucien's expression did not change. Evelina folded her arms tightly. You sold me to this family 3 days ago. Pain flickered briefly across Jonathan's face. Real pain. That unsettled her more than manipulation would have. I was trying to protect you. The statement hung in the room absurdly. Evelina stared at him. From what? Jonathan looked toward Lucien instinctively before answering. From them. Silence. Lucien crossed slowly toward the fireplace. Interesting choice of timing, Whitcomb. Jonathan's jaw tightened faintly. You knew they would come eventually. Evelina looked between them carefully. Who? Neither man answered immediately. That frightened her more than shouting would have. Jonathan removed something slowly from inside his coat pocket. A folded envelope yellowed with age. His fingers shook slightly while holding it. Your mother left this before she disappeared. Evelina felt her heartbeat slow. Lucien became completely still beside the fire. Jonathan continued quietly. She made me swear never to open it unless someone came searching for you. His eyes lifted toward Lucien. Someone finally did. Evelina stepped forward without realizing it. You had this all these years? Yes. And you never told me? Jonathan's face tightened with exhaustion. Because ignorance kept you alive. The exact same logic. Her mother. Lucien. Now her father. Everyone seemed united only by secrecy. Evelina reached for the envelope slowly. Jonathan hesitated, then released it into her hands. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingertips. Across the front, written in elegant dark ink, were 4 words. For my daughter only. The handwriting matched Aurora's journal perfectly. Evelina looked toward Lucien instinctively. His expression remained unreadable now, guarded in ways she had not seen before. She broke the seal carefully. Inside rested a single folded letter, and a small silver key attached to black ribbon. Another key. Her pulse quickened immediately. 3 now. The necklace. The library key. This one. Evelina unfolded the letter slowly while thunder rolled faintly across the distant cliffs beyond Blackthorn Hall. My dearest Evelina, if you are reading this, then Blackthorn has found you again. The room around her seemed to disappear. She continued silently. Do not trust the Ravenshade men. Especially the one who claims he is protecting you. Evelina's fingers tightened slightly against the page. She looked toward Lucien at once. He did not move. Jonathan spoke quietly into the silence. Your mother feared him. Evelina lowered her gaze back toward the letter. Lucien will tell you he tried to save us. He will tell you Edward was dangerous. Perhaps both are true. But there are things even Lucien Ravenshade does not understand about the night your uncle died. Evelina's breathing slowed. Uncle. The word struck harder than anything else inside the letter. Not Edward. Your uncle. Her eyes moved rapidly across the remaining lines. The truth of your birth was hidden because your life became valuable the moment Edward died. If the Ravenshades discover what you truly inherited, they will never let you leave Blackthorn Hall alive. The silence afterward felt endless. Evelina stared at the final sentence without blinking. Then slowly she looked up toward her father. What does this mean? Jonathan's face had gone pale beneath the firelight. Your mother wanted you far away from this family. That is not an answer. Her voice sharpened now. What did I inherit? Jonathan looked toward Lucien again before speaking. Blackthorn itself. The room became completely still. Even the fire seemed quieter suddenly. Evelina stared at him without understanding. That is impossible. Jonathan shook his head slowly. No, Lucien finally spoke. Enough. His voice remained calm. Too calm. Jonathan turned toward him immediately. You knew. Lucien said nothing. Jonathan laughed once under his breath. Bitter. Exhausted. Of course you did. Evelina looked sharply toward Lucien now. What is he talking about? Lucien held her gaze steadily. Your mother was never engaged to Edward for love. The answer arrived like cold steel beneath water. She was chosen because the Ashcombe bloodline controlled the original Blackthorn inheritance. Evelina struggled to breathe evenly. Lucien continued quietly. When Edward died without legitimate heirs, the inheritance should have transferred through Aurora. Jonathan stepped backward toward the fireplace. Your father would never allow that. Lucien's expression darkened. No, suddenly everything aligned with terrifying precision. The fear. The secrecy. The disappearance. Her mother had not simply fled Blackthorn Hall. She had escaped carrying the legal inheritance to the estate itself. Evelina looked toward the silver key still hanging from the black ribbon in her hand. This is why everyone is searching for the journal. Jonathan nodded once weakly. Aurora hid proof before she vanished. Evelina turned slowly toward Lucien. And you married me because you wanted control of Blackthorn. Silence. Deep and dangerous. Lucien looked at her for several long seconds before answering. No, then why? His gray eyes remained fixed steadily upon hers. Because someone else already tried to kill you for it. The room seemed to lose warmth entirely. Jonathan went visibly pale. Evelina stared at Lucien without speaking. He crossed toward her slowly now. Controlled. Careful. The carriage accident near York last winter was not random. Her pulse stopped for one terrible second. What? The fire at your father's warehouse 2 years ago was not random either. Jonathan lowered his head sharply. Shame moved visibly through him now. Lucien's voice remained calm. Neither was the man who followed you through the market in Durham 6 months ago. Evelina felt cold spread through every part of her body. Memories surfaced instantly. Moments she had dismissed. Strange accidents. Faces lingering too long in crowds. Jonathan spoke hoarsely into the silence. I tried to keep you hidden. Lucien looked toward him with quiet contempt. You tried to keep yourself alive. No one denied it. Rain continued against the windows while firelight flickered across the letter, trembling faintly in Evelina's hands. Then suddenly another realization struck her. She looked directly at Lucien. You have been watching me. Silence. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly as though the answer already exhausted him. Lucien did not look away. Yes. Evelina felt the world narrow sharply around that single word. For how long? His expression remained unreadable. Since you were 6 years old. The drawing room became unbearably quiet after Lucien's confession. Firelight moved softly across the walls while rain continued against the tall windows in uneven silver streaks. Evelina stood motionless near the center of the room with her mother's letter still trembling faintly between her fingers. Since you were 6 years old. The words repeated through her mind with terrible clarity. Not obsession. Not romance. Surveillance. Protection. Ownership. She no longer knew which frightened her most. Jonathan Whitcomb lowered himself slowly into one of the armchairs near the fireplace as though the strength had finally left his body. He looked exhausted now. Smaller than she remembered. Lucien remained standing across from her, calm and unreadable beneath the flickering gold light. That composure suddenly felt unbearable. You watched me for 13 years. Evelina's voice came quietly at first. Without telling me. Lucien did not deny it. Yes. The honesty struck harder than excuses would have. Why? Another silence. Then he answered. Because people were searching for you. That is not enough. Her breathing sharpened slightly now. You followed my life. Lucien's gaze remained fixed steadily upon hers. I made certain you remained alive. Jonathan rubbed one trembling hand across his face. You do not understand what was happening after Aurora disappeared. Evelina turned sharply toward him. Then explain it. Jonathan looked toward the fire rather than her. Your mother ran from Blackthorn because she discovered Edward intended to force her marriage before the inheritance transfer became official. Cold moved through Evelina's chest. Force. Jonathan swallowed carefully. The Ashcombe inheritance included legal control over Blackthorn lands. Once the marriage contract finalized, the Ravenshades would gain permanent claim. Evelina remembered Lucien's earlier words. Edward understood how to make people trust him, even when they should not. Suddenly her mother's fear no longer seemed irrational. Aurora tried to leave quietly, Jonathan continued. But Edward realized she intended to disappear before the wedding. Lucien finally spoke again. He confronted her the night of the storm. Evelina looked immediately toward him. At the cliffs. Yes. And you were there. The room became still again. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. I arrived after they left the house. Jonathan laughed once under his breath. Bitter. That is not entirely true. Lucien's eyes darkened. Be careful, Whitcomb. No, Jonathan slowly stood again from the armchair. I have been careful for 19 years. His voice shook now. Not with fear. Exhaustion. And it destroyed all of us anyway. Evelina stared between them. What are you hiding? Jonathan looked directly at Lucien while answering. Your husband loved your mother. Silence swallowed the room whole. Evelina felt her heartbeat stop for one terrible second. Lucien did not move. Did not deny it. Fire cracked softly behind him while rain tapped against the windows like distant fingers. Jonathan continued hoarsely. Edward discovered it shortly before the engagement ceremony. Evelina looked slowly toward Lucien. His face remained perfectly controlled. Too controlled. Is that true? She whispered. Lucien answered after a long silence. Yes. The word entered the room quietly and changed everything inside it. Evelina suddenly understood the music room. The journal. The Tower Library preserved untouched for 11 years. The grief Veronica spoke about. None of it had ever belonged to Edward Ravenshade. You loved her. Lucien's expression shifted almost invisibly. Pain beneath restraint. Yes. Evelina tightened her grip against the letter. And she loved you. Lucien looked away first. Toward the storm-dark windows. That no longer matters. But it did matter. Evelina saw it instantly. It explained every silence inside Blackthorn Hall. Every unfinished sentence. Every careful avoidance whenever Aurora's name appeared. Jonathan moved unsteadily toward the drinks cabinet near the fireplace. Edward threatened to expose them both if Aurora tried to break the engagement. His hand shook slightly while pouring whiskey into a crystal glass. He told her Lucien would lose everything. Evelina looked back toward her father. What happened at the cliffs? Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Aurora met Edward there because he sent a message claiming Lucien had been injured. Lucien became completely still beside the windows. How do you know that? Jonathan lowered the glass slowly. Because Aurora told me herself. Silence followed. Lucien's expression darkened dangerously now. You never mentioned that before. You never asked. Jonathan swallowed another mouthful of whiskey. Aurora found Edward alone near the eastern ridge. They argued. Evelina listened without breathing evenly now. Edward tried to force her back to the estate before dawn. The storm outside intensified briefly as though the night itself remembered. Jonathan's voice lowered further. Then Lucien arrived. Evelina looked immediately toward him. Lucien remained motionless. Edward attacked him first. The words settled heavily into the room. Aurora tried to stop them. Jonathan's hands tightened around the glass. Then Edward fell. Silence. Endless silence. Evelina stared at Lucien. Did you kill your brother? The question finally existed aloud between them after 19 years. Lucien's eyes met hers steadily. No. But he died because of you. Another pause. Yes. The honesty hurt more than denial would have. Evelina turned away sharply toward the fire. Her thoughts felt fractured now. Her mother had loved Lucien. Edward died during their confrontation. Aurora fled carrying a child tied to the Blackthorn inheritance. And Lucien spent 13 years watching that child from the shadows. Nothing inside this house had ever been accidental. Jonathan's voice came quietly behind her. Aurora believed the previous Duke would blame Lucien for Edward's death. Evelina looked back slowly. Would he? Lucien answered himself this time. He did. Firelight moved across the hard lines of his face. My father spent the next 11 years destroying every trace of Aurora Ashcombe from Blackthorn Hall. Evelina remembered the hidden portraits, the locked library, the silence everywhere. Lucien continued quietly. He searched for you until the day he died. A chill passed through her arms. Why? Lucien looked directly at her now. Because if you survived, the inheritance remained legally unresolved. Jonathan lowered his gaze toward the whiskey glass trembling faintly in his hand. Aurora believed they would eventually kill you to settle it permanently. Evelina closed her eyes briefly. Suddenly every strange accident from her childhood carried new meaning. The warehouse fire. The carriage crash. The man following her through Durham Market. Not random misfortunes. Attempts. Lucien crossed toward her slowly. When my father died 3 years ago, the search began again. His voice remained calm. Veronica discovered enough documents to realize someone hidden still carried the Ashcombe claim. Evelina looked toward him carefully. And you found me first? Yes. Why? The question emerged more quietly this time. More dangerous. Lucien stopped directly before her. Because I promised Aurora I would. Silence. Deep and terrible. Evelina stared at him without moving. Jonathan spoke weakly from across the room. That is not the whole truth. Lucien's eyes sharpened immediately. Enough. Jonathan shook his head slowly. She deserves all of it. Evelina felt tension tighten instantly through the room again. What else? Jonathan looked toward her with exhausted sorrow. Lucien did not marry you to control the inheritance. He swallowed carefully. He married you because the final transfer becomes permanent only if an Ashcombe heir willingly accepts Blackthorn as home. Evelina's pulse slowed dangerously. What does that mean? Jonathan's voice nearly broke. The estate already belongs to you. Silence consumed the drawing room entirely. Firelight flickered across Lucien's face while the storm raged outside the windows. Evelina stared at him. You knew. Lucien did not deny it. Yes. Then why marry me at all? His expression softened very slightly for the first time since she arrived at Blackthorn Hall. Not weakness. Something far more dangerous. Regret. Because once Veronica discovered the truth, he said quietly, you would not have survived another winter alone. Evelina did not leave the drawing room until sunrise. The storm had finally weakened into soft gray rain drifting across the cliffs beyond Blackthorn Hall. Pale morning light filtered through the tall windows in thin silver lines, washing the room of its shadows without making anything feel clearer. Jonathan Whitcomb had been escorted to the guest quarters an hour earlier under Lucien's instruction. The servants moved quietly through the estate once again. Fires were relit. Breakfast trays carried through corridors. Doors opened and closed softly in distant wings of the house. Yet nothing inside Evelina felt ordinary anymore. Blackthorn belonged to her. The realization sat heavily beneath every thought. Not metaphorically. Legally. Entire generations of Ravenshades had spent 19 years hiding, protecting, or searching for the same truth now resting silently inside her hands. She stood alone beside the drawing room windows with Aurora's letter folded carefully against her chest. Behind her, Lucien remained near the fireplace. He had not attempted to approach her again after Jonathan left. That restraint somehow unsettled her more than pressure would have. Did my mother know the estate would eventually pass to me? She asked quietly. Lucien answered after a brief silence. Yes. Evelina stared out toward the fog-covered gardens below. Then why hide me at all? Because ownership of Blackthorn is not simple property. His voice remained low and calm behind her. The original Ashcombe inheritance included rights older than the Ravenshade title itself. Evelina turned slowly toward him. What does that mean? Lucien crossed toward the writing desk near the wall and removed a folded document from one of the drawers. Blackthorn Hall was built upon Ashcombe land 200 years ago. The Ravenshades governed it through marriage contracts and blood agreements. He placed the document carefully before her. But the estate itself legally returns to the last surviving Ashcombe heir if the direct Ravenshade line collapses. Evelina lowered her eyes toward the page. Old ink. Wax seals. Names written in elegant fading script. Aurora Ashcombe appeared twice near the center. So did Edward Ravenshade. Then below them, in smaller legal notation, another line. Issue of blood inheritance unresolved pending survival confirmation. Evelina's breath slowed painfully. They knew about me before I was born. Yes. Lucian's expression darkened faintly. My father ordered lawyers to prepare inheritance transfers immediately after Aurora disappeared. Evelina looked up sharply. Because he believed I existed. Because he feared it. Silence stretched between them. Outside the windows, fog rolled slowly across the distant cliffs. You said the inheritance becomes permanent only if I willingly accept Blackthorn as home. Lucian's gaze remained fixed steadily upon hers. Yes. And if I refuse? Another pause. The claim remains legally suspended. Evelina tightened her fingers around the letter. Meaning Veronica could still contest it. Yes. And that is why everyone is searching for the hidden documents. Lucian nodded once. Aurora hid proof of the final inheritance transfer before she vanished. Evelina thought suddenly of the missing journal page. The keys. The portrait moved during the night. Nothing had ever been random. How many people know the truth? She asked quietly. Lucian looked toward the windows briefly before answering. Very few. Veronica. Yes. My father. Yes. Evelina swallowed carefully. And you. His expression changed almost imperceptibly then. Something weary beneath restraint. I learned the truth after my father died. Silence settled softly around them again. Evelina studied him carefully now. For days she had viewed Lucian Ravenshade as a man built entirely from control, coldness, authority. But grief complicated people. So did guilt. You could have claimed the estate yourself. The observation came quietly. Lucian looked directly at her. No, you are the Duke. Titles and ownership are not the same. He crossed slowly toward the windows where she stood. Blackthorn was never truly mine. The honesty in the statement unsettled her unexpectedly. Evelina lowered her gaze toward Aurora's letter once more. Then why did my mother tell me not to trust you? The question lingered heavily between them. Lucian did not answer immediately. Because she believed I failed her. Firelight flickered faintly behind him while morning gray spread across the room. Evelina waited. Eventually Lucian continued quietly. Aurora asked me to leave Blackthorn with her the night Edward died. A strange stillness moved through Evelina's chest. Did you? No, the single word carried more regret than any explanation could have. Lucian looked toward the rain-streaked windows. I believed I could still protect her from inside the family. Evelina already knew how that story ended. Aurora vanished. Edward died. The previous Duke spent years hunting shadows through England, while Lucian watched from a distance, as the child Aurora left behind grew up under another man's name. My mother never forgave you. Lucian's jaw tightened faintly. No silence followed. Deep. Human. Then suddenly footsteps echoed rapidly through the corridor outside the drawing room. Not servant footsteps. Urgent. A second later, Mrs. Weatherby entered carrying a small wooden box wrapped in dark cloth. Her normally composed face revealed visible concern. Your Grace. She looked directly toward Lucian first. It was found beneath the east staircase wall during the storm repairs. Lucian became still immediately. Who found it? Masons replacing water damage. Mrs. Weatherby crossed carefully into the room and placed the box upon the writing desk between them. The wall compartment appears intentionally hidden. Evelina's pulse quickened slightly. The box itself looked old. Dust-covered. Small enough to fit in both hands. A faded Ashcombe crest remained carved faintly across the lid. Lucian stared at it without touching it. Open it, Evelina whispered. Mrs. Weatherby stepped back immediately. Lucian finally lifted the lid slowly. Inside rested several folded papers tied with black ribbon. A silver signet ring bearing the Ashcombe crest. And beneath them all, another letter addressed in Aurora's handwriting. For L. Only if Evelina returns. The room became silent. Lucian stared at the envelope for several long seconds without moving. Evelina watched him carefully. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall, genuine emotion crossed his face openly. Not grief exactly. Fear. He reached toward the letter slowly, but Evelina touched his wrist before he could take it. Lucien looked up immediately. "She wrote it for you," Evelina said quietly. Neither of them moved for one suspended moment. Then Lucien withdrew his hand. Evelina lifted the envelope herself and broke the seal carefully. Inside rested only a single page. "Lucien, if she has returned, then you failed to keep her hidden long enough." Evelina glanced toward him instinctively before continuing. "I know you will blame yourself for what comes next. Do not. Edward made his choice long before the cliffs. My father made his choice long before my engagement. And I made mine the moment I realized what Blackthorn would become if they ever discovered the child was yours." The room disappeared around Evelina entirely. She stopped breathing. Slowly she lowered the page. Lucien stood motionless beside the desk, his face emptied of all expression now. Even the fire seemed distant suddenly. Evelina stared at him in complete silence. Then finally, almost unable to hear her own voice, she whispered, "You are my father." No one spoke for several seconds after the words left Evelina's mouth. Morning light drifted silently across the drawing room windows while rain softened into mist beyond the cliffs. Mrs. Weatherby stood near the doorway with her hands folded tightly before her apron, her face pale beneath years of practiced composure. The small wooden box remained open upon the desk between them. Aurora's letter rested in Evelina's trembling fingers. And Lucien Ravenshade stood motionless as though the truth itself had finally exhausted the last strength required to hide it. He did not deny it. That hurt more than shock would have. Evelina stared at him across the room, searching for something familiar inside his face now that she understood why certain pieces of herself had always felt misplaced. The gray eyes, the silence, the strange instinct to observe before speaking. Pieces of a man she married without ever truly knowing. Or perhaps she had never married him at all. Lucien lowered his gaze briefly toward the floor before finally speaking. "Yes." The single word entered the room quietly. Final. Evelina felt the world around her shift into something unrecognizable. Every memory from the past week rearranged itself instantly. The necklace, the surveillance, the marriage proposal, the way he watched her rather than touched her. None of it had been romantic possession. It had been protection twisted into secrecy so deeply that even she became trapped inside it. Mrs. Weatherby quietly left the room without instruction, closing the doors softly behind her. The estate itself seemed to withdraw from the moment. Evelina looked back toward Aurora's letter. "My father made his choice long before my engagement. And I made mine the moment I realized what Blackthorn would become if they ever discovered the child was yours." Her voice came quietly now. Fragile only because it was controlled. "You knew before I was born." Lucien nodded once. "Aurora told me the night she disappeared." Evelina swallowed carefully against the pressure tightening inside her chest. "And you let another man raise me." Pain crossed Lucien's face then. "Brief. Real. I did not have a choice. You are the Duke of Blackthorn." The anger arrived slowly now beneath her calm. "You controlled half of northern England." "Not my father." His answer came immediately. "Not then." Silence followed. Lucien crossed toward the windows overlooking the fog-covered cliffs beyond the estate. The previous duke believed Aurora carried Edward's heir. His voice remained low and steady. "When Edward died, the family inheritance became unstable. If my father learned the child belonged to me instead, he would have taken you before birth." Evelina closed her eyes briefly. Suddenly she understood the desperation behind Aurora's disappearance. The secrecy. The hidden letters. Her mother had not fled from heartbreak alone. She fled from inheritance itself. So she chose Jonathan Whitcomb. Yes. Lucien stared out toward the cliffs. "Aurora believed obscurity would protect you better than power." Evelina laughed once softly beneath her breath. Not amusement. Exhaustion. Did she love him? No, the answer arrived without hesitation. Jonathan was simply willing to disappear. Silence settled again. Deep and human now. Evelina looked toward the silver signet ring resting inside the open wooden box. The Ashcombe crest glimmered faintly beneath morning light. Everything she believed about herself had collapsed within a single hour. Daughter, wife, heir. None of the words meant what they had yesterday. Why marry me? She asked finally. Lucian turned slowly from the windows. Because legally it was the only protection strong enough to keep Veronica from challenging your claim. Evelina stared at him. You married your own daughter. Pain darkened his expression immediately. No, his voice lowered sharply. The marriage was never legal. She became still. Lucian crossed toward the desk and opened one of the hidden documents from the wooden box. Aurora anticipated this possibility before she disappeared. He handed the paper toward her carefully. The Ashcombe bloodline agreement invalidates any union unknowingly formed between direct heirs. Evelina read the lines slowly. Ancient legal language. Blood protections older than the Ravenshade title itself. The marriage ceremony had never been binding. Blackthorn law itself prevented it. She looked up slowly. You knew. Yes. And everyone else? Only myself and Mrs. Weatherby. Relief should have arrived. Instead, something heavier settled inside her chest. Because the truth did not erase the loneliness behind it. 13 years of being watched from a distance. A lifetime built beside strangers while her real father stood hidden behind another name. Evelina lowered the paper carefully onto the desk. You should have told me. Lucian's eyes remained fixed steadily upon hers. I wanted to. Then why did you not? He hesitated for the first time since she met him. Because once you knew, you could never leave Blackthorn safely again. Silence. Then slowly Evelina understood the final shape of it. Lucian had not brought her home because he wanted ownership. He brought her because discovery had already begun. Veronica searching the archives. The missing journal page. The attacks growing closer every year. Blackthorn Hall had become less prison than fortress. You were trying to keep me alive. Lucian said nothing. He did not need to. Outside the windows, the storm clouds finally began breaking apart over the cliffs. Pale winter sunlight spread slowly across the distant sea below Blackthorn Hall for the first time in days. Evelina looked toward him carefully now. Really looked. The man before her was not cold in the way society described. He was exhausted. A man who spent 19 years carrying grief, guilt, and fear beneath silence because speaking any of it aloud might have exposed her. Did my mother forgive you before she died? She asked softly. Lucian became very still. Then he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and removed a final folded letter worn pale from age. Aurora sent this 6 months before the fever took her. He handed it toward her carefully. Evelina unfolded the paper. The handwriting shook more than the earlier letters. Lucian, if Evelina survives long enough to return to Blackthorn one day, promise me something. Do not let her inherit our grief with the estate. Let her inherit only the truth. Evelina's vision blurred slightly for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Hall. She continued reading silently. She has your eyes. I noticed them the morning she was born. And every terrible thing suddenly became worth surviving. A tear slipped quietly down Evelina's cheek before she realized she was crying. Lucian looked away immediately, granting privacy even now. That small act hurt more than comfort would have. Evelina folded the letter carefully against her chest. You kept this all these years? Yes. Why? Lucian's gaze lifted toward her once more. Gray eyes carrying 19 years of unfinished sorrow. Because it was the only proof I ever had that Aurora did not regret loving me. Silence filled the drawing room softly. Not oppressive now. Human. Outside, sunlight touched the cliffs below Blackthorn Hall in pale silver bands, while the last remnants of storm mist drifted slowly out toward the sea. Evelina moved toward the windows beside him. For the first time since arriving, the estate no longer felt like a haunted monument built upon secrets. It felt older than that. Sadder. A place where love and fear had spent too many years buried together beneath silence. She looked out across the grounds her mother once fled and finally understood the strange ache she felt since entering the gates. Blackthorn Hall had never been waiting for a duchess. It had been waiting for its lost daughter to come home.